Football legends are still angry about how Bobby Moore died, the man who lifted the World Cup for England, the captain, the hero. He spent his final days freezing in a commentary box at Wembley, working for a freelancer's wage, while the officials who owed him everything sat in heated luxury just floors below. 7 days later, he was dead at 51, and the truth his teammates reveal is even worse than you think. Before we go further, make sure you subscribe, because what happened to Bobby Moore raises a question we need you to answer in the comments. Would today's legends be treated the same way? The story actually begins in 1964, 2 years before the World Cup. Bobby Moore was 23 years old. He had just been given the England captaincy. The future looked golden. Then came the diagnosis: testicular cancer. In 1960s, Britain cancer was rarely even spoken out loud. People called it the Big C. For a professional athlete, it was seen as a death sentence. The stigma alone could end a career. Moore underwent surgery to remove the affected testicle. The recovery was remarkably quick. But here is what makes this extraordinary. Sir Geoff Hurst revealed that Moore kept the entire thing secret. From the public, from the press, from most of his teammates. He was terrified the selectors would write him off, that the FA would strip him of the captaincy, that his World Cup dream would be over before it began. So, he suffered in silence. This decision established a pattern that would define the rest of his life. Moore learned to suppress vulnerability, to hide pain, to never ask for help. It was this stoicism that made him a great captain. But it was also this stoicism that would later be mistaken for not needing anything at all. Now let's reframe 1966. Everyone remembers the image. Bobby Moore wiping his hands on the velvet cloth before shaking the Queen's hand. The calmness, the dignity, the perfection. But knowing what we know now, that moment becomes something else entirely. He was not just a footballer collecting a trophy. He was a cancer survivor who had silently defeated death to reach that podium. The supernatural calmness that teammates like Jock Stein talked about suddenly makes sense. Stein joked that Moore knew what was happening 20 minutes before everyone else. When you have faced mortality at 23, the pressure of a World Cup final probably feels less terrifying than it does to everyone around you. But here is where the tragedy begins. By successfully hiding his pain, Moore created an image of effortless perfection. And this image would work against him, because when he struggled after retirement, the establishment assumed the golden boy did not need help. They mistook his silence for contentment, his dignity for aloofness. Moore played over 544 games for West Ham United. He captained them to FA Cup glory, to a European Cup Winners' Cup. He is the greatest player in the club's history, yet Harry Redknapp described what happened next as borderline criminal. Moore was never offered a coaching role, never given a directorship, never made an ambassador. Redknapp said Moore felt like an outsider at the club he helped build. The ownership viewed his celebrity with suspicion rather than pride. They effectively dumped him. Martin Peters provided an even more haunting image. He called Moore a ghost at Wembley. Moore would sometimes have to buy his own tickets to watch matches at Upton Park, or rely on friends to get him in. There was no standing invitation to the director's box, no permanent seat for the captain. Security guards would stop him because they did not recognise him. He had to park in public lots like everyone else. The man whose spirit filled the stadium was relegated to the margins, but the Football Association's treatment was even worse. After Don Revie resigned as England manager in 1977, Moore wrote a handwritten letter to the FA. He offered his services. He was not demanding the top job. He just wanted to help in any capacity. The FA did not even reply. Total silence. This was the only Englishman to ever captain a World Cup winning side, and the national body could not be bothered to send a single letter back. Compare this to how other nations treated their legends. Franz Beckenbauer won the World Cup for Germany as captain. He was immediately integrated into the system. He managed the national team. He became president of Bayern Munich. He led Germany's successful bid for the 2006 World Cup. Beckenbauer said Moore maintained a royal dignity and never used his status to beg. But that dignity became a handicap in the political world of football administration. Pelé was even more direct. He called Moore the greatest defender he ever played against. A gentleman, Pelé said he was shocked that England did not treat Moore as a high-ranking national ambassador. In Brazil, a figure of Moore's stature would represent the nation at every World Cup, at every major tournament. Pelé viewed England's failure to use Moore as a waste of a national asset. Think about what this means. The greatest player in history looked at Bobby Moore and saw someone who should have been untouchable, someone who should have been given everything. And instead, Moore had nothing. Pelé could not understand it. Beckenbauer could not understand it. These were men who knew what it meant to be a World Cup winning captain. They knew the weight of that achievement, the sacrifice, the pressure, and they watched England treat their equivalent like he was disposable. The FA was run by what people called the Blazer Brigade: amateur administrators, school teachers, local dignitaries, committee men who viewed professional players with suspicion. Moore was too cool for them. His friendships with Sean Connery and Frank Sinatra made them uncomfortable. His movie star looks, his confidence, they saw it as arrogance. They saw him as a threat to their authority. So they froze him out. There was also the shadow of Bogota. In 1970, before the World Cup, Moore was falsely accused of stealing a bracelet in Colombia. He was arrested. The charges were completely fabricated. He was exonerated. But in the conservative corridors of the FA, the scandal stuck. It gave his detractors an excuse. They could point to it and say he was a risk. It became a reason to deny him the England manager job, a reason to keep him at arm's length, even though he had done nothing wrong. And this is what makes it all so cruel. Moore fell into a gap. He played in the era before the Premier League, before the massive wages, before the safety nets. There was no players' union strong enough to demand pensions for legends. There were no guaranteed testimonial years to set players up for life. Moore generated millions in value for the FA and West Ham. But he captured almost none of it for himself. He was caught between two worlds, too late for the gentleman amateur era, too early for the corporate superstar age. The most painful near miss came in 1977. Moore met Elton John at the Howard Hotel in London. The two men shook hands on a deal for Moore to become manager of Watford. Moore believed his second career was finally beginning. He waited by the phone for weeks. The call never came. Instead, he learned through the newspapers that the job had been given to Graham Taylor. The Watford board had overruled Elton John. They cited Moore's lack of managerial experience. While Taylor went on to become a legendary manager, the rejection reinforced Moore's belief that football had closed its doors to him. Imagine what that moment must have felt like. You shake hands with one of the biggest stars in the world. You believe the deal is done. You start planning your future. And then, nothing. Silence. And then you read in the newspaper that someone else got the job. You were not even told directly. You had to find out the way everyone else did. Moore's first wife, Tina, described how devastating this was for him. He had finally allowed himself to hope, to believe that his knowledge and experience mattered, and then the door slammed shut again. This became the pattern of Moore's post-retirement life. Every door that seemed to open would close before he could walk through it. The FA ignored his letter. West Ham gave him no role. Watford gave the job to someone else. And so Moore did what proud men do when the world rejects them. He kept moving. He took whatever work he could find. He managed Oxford City in non-league football. He went to Southend United in the lower divisions. He even travelled all the way to Hong Kong to manage Eastern AA. These jobs highlighted the desperation of England's greatest captain to find work in the game he loved. The stints were largely unsuccessful. Redknapp observed that players with Moore's natural intuition often struggle to coach those who cannot see what they see. And here is the part people forget. Bobby Moore was not rich. He played during an era when wages were modest. The maximum wage had only been abolished in 1961. Moore did not retire with a fortune. His business ventures failed. A sports marketing company collapsed. Pub ownership went wrong. By the early 1990s, Moore was not a wealthy man. He was a working man. There was no FA pension, no club ambassadorial salary. He had to work to pay his bills. His primary income came from working as a football commentator for Capital Gold Radio. This was not a hobby. It was a necessity. This is what separates Moore's era from today. Modern players retire as millionaires. They have investments, property portfolios, endorsement deals that last decades. But Moore had none of that. The money he earned during his playing career was modest by any standard, and the business world was not kind to him. Bad partnerships, bad luck, bad timing. By the time he reached his 50s, he was living month to month. The greatest captain England ever had was one bad month away from real financial trouble, and the institutions he had served gave him nothing to fall back on. In 1991, Moore was diagnosed with bowel cancer. Once again, he chose secrecy. He underwent surgery. He went through chemotherapy. He kept the severity from the public. By early 1993, the cancer had spread to his liver. It was terminal. But he refused to stop working. This was the second time cancer had come for him. The first time, at 23, he had beaten it and gone on to lift the World Cup. But this time was different. This time, there would be no recovery, no miracle, no comeback. And yet, even facing death, Moore maintained the same silence he had practiced his entire life. He did not want pity. He did not want special treatment. He just wanted to keep going, to keep working, to maintain his dignity until the very end. The people closest to him knew something was wrong. His appearance had changed. He was losing weight rapidly. His energy was fading. But Moore gave interviews where he talked about the future. He made plans. He showed up to work. He kept the mask in place. Because that was who Bobby Moore was. A man who would rather suffer in private than burden others with his pain. A man who believed that asking for help was a form of weakness. And so he carried the weight alone. February the 17th, 1993. England faced San Marino in a World Cup qualifier at Wembley. The match is remembered for San Marino scoring after just 8.3 seconds. A humiliation for England. But in the press box, a greater tragedy was unfolding. Moore was there to commentate for Capital Gold. He was visibly dying. Frank Lampard Sr. and Jr. have spoken about the shock of seeing him that night. He was gaunt. His skin was pale. His clothes hung off his frame. He wore a heavy leather coat with the collar turned up, a cap pulled low. Trying to hide what the disease had done to him, the Lampards were not the only ones who noticed. Everyone in that press box knew. Journalists who had covered Moore for decades could barely look at him. Some wanted to say something, to offer help, to tell him to go home. But Moore would not hear it. He was there to do a job. He had his notes prepared. His voice was steady. He was the professional to the very end. Even as his body was shutting down around him, witnesses described Moore as being in visible pain, shifting uncomfortably in the cramped commentary position. Yet, he fulfilled his duties. He analysed the game with his trademark precision. He criticised England's defensive lapses while his own body was failing. And here is the image that defines everything. While FA officials sat in the heated luxury of the Royal Box, the man who won them the World Cup sat in a freezing press gantry, working for a freelancer's fee, because the game had provided him no safety net. 7 days later, Bobby Moore died at his home, February the 24th, 1993. He was 51 years old. The announcement triggered a wave of national mourning. Flowers piled up at Upton Park, at Wembley. The public loved him. But the institutions had let him die in the cold. It was only after his death that the establishment scrambled to fix their neglect. In 2007, a massive bronze statue was unveiled at the new Wembley. Moore now overlooks the Wembley Way that he once walked as a ticket holder. The inscription calls him the Master of Wembley. Lord of the Game. The Bobby Moore Fund was established by his widow Stephanie. It has raised millions for bowel cancer research. His legacy now saves lives in a way the FA never allowed him to when he was alive. West Ham finally retired the number 6 shirt. They named stands after him. They integrated him into the fabric of the club. But it was too late for him to see it. The truth that the legends reveal is this: Bobby Moore was not just a victim of cancer. He was a victim of a sporting culture that consumed its heroes and then discarded them. Sir Geoff Hurst reveals the physical price Moore paid in secret in 1964. The cancer he hid to serve his country. Harry Redknapp and Martin Peters reveal the social price, the exclusion, the loneliness, the feeling of being a ghost in his own stadium. Frank Lampard reveals the economic price, the image of a dying World Cup captain working in the cold because he had no pension. And Pelé and Beckenbauer reveal the comparative shame, the realisation that the world valued Bobby Moore more than England ever did. Bobby Moore died with his dignity intact. That was his choice. But the shame of his final years belongs entirely to the Football Association and West Ham United. The statue at Wembley stands tall, magnificent, permanent, but it casts a long shadow, a shadow that falls over the institutions that let the man himself wither, that let him freeze, that let him work until 7 days before his death because they had given him nothing. He was the captain, the legend, the man of bronze, and in the end, he was treated like he was nobody at all. If this story moved you, hit the like button and leave a comment telling us what you think Bobby Moore's legacy should be. How should football treat its legends? Because his story is a reminder. Glory fades, institutions forget, but the people who gave everything deserve better than silence.